I'm Mark from The Analog Process, and in this video we're going to be covering the history of modern American photography, including various influential artists from the late 19th century all the way up to about the 1970s, and two very influential photography exhibits, the New Documents exhibit and Family of Man. I'll avoid art jargon as much as possible. Whenever I mention an artist by name, I'll be sure to tell you not only who he was and what he did, but also why he was important and why you should know him. I know personally when I was researching all of the artists who make this video, it started shaping how I was looking at work and looking at my own work. And my hope is that after watching this video, you'll find that you'll be able to dive in more deep into understanding contemporary photography, your photography, and the history of photography as a whole. But before any of that, it's important that we understand what makes American photography different or unique from the photography that was coming out of Europe or Asia at the time period. So let's dive right in by painting a picture of what American photography is all about. When we think of American photography, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Well, for many people, including me, it's the land. And there's good reason for that. More than any other country, America has made a myth of the land, of the frontier, and that has been pervasive in how we think about art, how we think about photography, and how we think about our own relationship to our country and to freedom as a whole. It's all about that frontier. It's all about pushing out, exploring, testing the boundaries. These are myths and stories that shape our cultural understanding. We're people who see ourselves, our dreams, and our values in the shape of the land itself. And it's no surprise that some of the most visually recognizable images out there are the images from Ansel Adams of the American West. Upon our land sits our democracy, where all things are created equal. That also includes in photography, there is no hierarchy of subject matter. So what do I mean by this? Well, it means that in American photography, we've seen that there are entire bodies of serious work that come from images and subject matter that is very benign, including fisherman's twill. The artist was able to see a potential greatness in this twine that you would find out in the major landscape of America itself. Everything was equal, it was democratic. Now, when we talk about American photography from this period, a large part of what we're actually discussing is the influence of three artist educators: Alfred Stieglitz, Minor White, and John Sarkowski. Of course, there are many other influential art educators of this time period, but these are the three that had such a big impact, and they're so important to the history of the medium itself, we're really gonna focus on them. But before we do, I want to talk about some of the early photographers, some of the early artists whose impact really shaped how we think about American photography today. As a new medium, photography really had no voice of its own. And we think about contemporary examples of that, we can actually look at Facebook and YouTube. So when Facebook came around, Facebook video, which is now already dated, don't get me wrong, but when Facebook video came around, people were first uploading videos that were very similar to YouTube, to the form of YouTube. So they were longer videos that had sound, they were designed in a certain way. But what people quickly found is that Facebook video needed to have a voice of its own. Videos on Facebook needed to be different in how they were constructed because the medium was different. The medium is the message, right? So typically now what you see on Facebook video is there's no sound, there's subtitles at the bottom. Videos are very, very short. We're talking 30 seconds to 60 seconds because the way people scroll through the feed is different than going onto YouTube, clicking a video and just having that video take up everything and not being distracted. So we can see already just with contemporary examples of Facebook video versus YouTube video that having a new art form requires an entirely new way to produce images, and the aesthetic of those images is totally different. So going back to early photography, it was the same way. Sure, we can just copy what everyone else was doing in Europe with their landscape paintings and just make landscapes, but photography was a new medium. It needed to have its own voice. Timothy O'Sullivan, born in 1840, was one of the first artists to step away from the aesthetic conventions of history and start making new work that was about the American landscape in a distinctly photographic and American way. This is a big step in photography. It's easy to look back at this and see it as fairly mundane, but at the time it was anything but. O'Sullivan was creating abstract flat forms against the brutal Western landscape while working for the government's 40th parallel survey. Just think about it like this. He was dabbling in abstraction 40 to 60 years before abstraction really took hold in the United States. Another worthy aspect of O'Sullivan's work was how he treated his sky. They were completely blown out. So why the big deal? Now, wet plates are only sensitive to blue light. What that means is when you do an exposure of a landscape like this that looks really nice, the sky, being that the sky is blue, will be completely blown out and you lose all the detail. And that doesn't really play nicely with European picturesque paintings, where you want billowy clouds and nice landscapes and you want it all together in one spot. So what they would do at the time is make two negatives, one for the sky, one for the ground, and then in post-processing, edit them together. By the way, post-processing is nothing new. It's been going on since the beginning of photography. But O'Sullivan didn't do this. He was interested in frankness. He embraced this starkness. It was really O'Sullivan that started this trend of documenting the American West. A landscape represents adventure and a better tomorrow, later challenged by Dorothy Lang, like in The Road West, New Mexico, 1938. O'Sullivan touched on the photographer as artist, but it was really Alfred Stieglitz that cemented the foundation for an artist to be considered a photographer and a photographer to be considered an artist. He expanded the language of American photography by fusing it with European pictorialism, by experimenting with photography with expressionism. And unlike O'Sullivan, who looked out west, Stieglitz instead looked inward, much like Minor White, the second influential artist educator who we're going to talk about soon. Stieglitz is known for his series Equivalents. They're basically photographs of clouds. His aim was for a photograph to stand in as an equivalent for something else. In other words, his goal was to separate the subject matter from the photography. They were not skies, they were abstractions. In fact, this was considered one of the first fully abstract series of photography. You know, you really can't understate the importance of Alfred Stieglitz to the world of photography and art as a whole. He was the first to create fully abstract photography, photographed during rain, ice, and snow. He was the first to do night and street photography, which is amazing to think about that he was experimenting with all of these new ways to express himself photographically, ways that inspired HBC to coin the term decisive moment and inspired Atget to go out and shoot Paris, the streets of Paris. This is just the beginning. Stieglitz also published Camera Work, which is an art publication very similar to Aperture today. If this wasn't enough, he also had a profound impact on the photographer Paul Strand, who's known for his blind woman photograph and other photographs during this time period. The next photographer that we're going to be talking about, I'm sure you're very familiar with already, Walker Evans. Walker Evans was all about Americanness, American things. He built a new vocabulary about American objects. But this language was partially started by artists before him. This includes gas station, cards, signs, commercial items, and related. The American experience is distilled down to the objects of everyday life. His seminal book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, was published in 1941. While seminal now, at the time, it only sold 600 copies. The images documented marginalized sharecropping families in the South. The title of the book is ironic, as the families are not just not famous, but ignored. The work of Lee Friedlander, Diane Arbus, Gary Winogrand, Robert Frank, and many others has been directly inspired by the vocabulary set into stone by Walker Evans.